The morning came slow over the lone territories, spilling its pale gold across the earth like a weary traveler laying down a tired lantern. The sky stretched wide and unbroken, soft as brushed cotton, and the wind moved with the unhurried grace of something that had lived here far longer than people ever would. And there, walking along the ridge where land dipped into quiet valleys, moved the figure everyone knew but few had ever truly looked at. She walked alone, tall as a wind-bent pine, wrapped in a ragged dress the color of forgotten bones. The world called her many things, but none of those names were her own. Some said she was the orphan giant. Others whispered she was a ghost of some ancient tribe. And a few, the cruel few, called her cursed. To most, she was simply the girl who didn't belong in a place built for smaller hearts. Her steps were long and gentle, barely disturbing the dust. Her shadow moved ahead of her, stretching over the dry earth like a loyal companion that never once questioned her worth. Her dress, patched and fraying, fluttered behind her like the torn banner of a kingdom that never had the chance to rise. The townsfolk watched her pass with the same expression people give to approaching storms. Uncertain, wary, hoping they'll blow another direction. Mothers pulled their children closer. Men narrowed their eyes, and women dipped their chins, whispering behind the safety of their fans. Yet none of them saw the truth of her. How each of her breaths came with caution. How she folded herself inward. How she tried to make her size smaller, softer, less offensive to the world. She wasn't born with thunder in her bones. She simply grew too big for the small imaginations around her. Down in the town of Willowbend, where buildings leaned from years of dust-laden wind, and the saloon's piano rarely held all its keys, the morning began in the usual ways. Chickens complained beside collapsing sheds. Horses stamped and blew steam into the cold dawn, and men flicked cards off rough tables with the same faces they wore for funerals. At the well by the main street, she stopped. Always here, always at this quiet place where no one had to look at her too long. She bent, careful not to snap the wooden rim with her weight, and dipped her hands into the water. The reflection that stared back at her was blurred by ripples, but she preferred it that way. Clarity only reminded her of what she was. Tall, too tall, broad-shouldered, hands like shovels, a face both fierce and gentle, but rarely understood. A few men gathered by the saloon doors, pretending she wasn't the reason their voices rose. Among them stood the man who loved being looked at, a gunslinger known for winning arguments without needing to make sense. A man called Clay Laramie. His coat was always too clean for a working man. His smile always too sharp for a kind one. He eyed the giant girl the way a rancher eyes a wild steer he doesn't plan on feeding. His voice cut across the street like a whip made of dry laughter. "That girl's a burden on the land," he said, though he pretended he was talking to no one in particular. "She takes space that ain't hers. Breeds air meant for real folk." The men beside him chuckled, the way men do when they don't want to be outcast from the pack. Her shoulders tightened, but she didn't turn. She simply lifted her gaze toward the horizon, as if the sun itself reminded her she still had somewhere to walk. And she left, water dripping from her fingers, hope slipping from her heart. Elias Whitmore watched from across the street. Most people didn't notice Elias unless they needed a stitch or a button or a patch of fabric rescued from the jaws of time. He was small in build, soft in spirit, and quiet in the ways the world often overlooked. His tailor shop sat beside the old post office, a place with windows that held more dust than light. Inside, the air always smelled faintly of cotton, chalk, and the patient thoughts of a man who lived by gentle work. That morning, Elias wasn't watching the townsfolk. He wasn't listening to Clay Laramie's harsh talk. His eyes were on her, the tall girl at the well, the one whose dress clung to her frame like a final apology from a life that had never given her softness. A rip along the hem, a tear across the shoulder, fabric thinned by too many years on the road, stitches long broken, colors drained by the sun. Yet she moved with a dignity that made Elias's chest tighten. He'd seen her before, passing through Willowbend like a wandering spirit, rarely stopping, never resting. But this morning felt different. as if the land itself held its breath. He crossed the street with a slow, careful step, his voice the kind that never startles anyone. "If I may mend that for you, miss." The words were meant to be gentle, but the moment they reached her ear, she stiffened. She didn't turn at first. Then she did, slowly, as though expecting mockery. Her eyes were cautious, dark as storm clouds that had learned not to pour rain where it wasn't wanted. "I don't need charity," her expression said long before her lips did. Elias shook his head softly. "Not charity, just the art I've been blessed to practice. And you, miss, deserve something that doesn't fall apart each time the wind sighs." The giant girl shifted her weight, unsure what to do with such words. Most days she knew exactly what people wanted from her. Distance, silence, obedience to whatever story they'd written about her. But this man had eyes that didn't widen in fear or narrow in insult. He simply looked at her the way sunlight looks at a meadow, softly, honestly, without expectations. Still she stepped back. Kindness from strangers was a dangerous thing. It promised hope she couldn't risk. "Thank you," she murmured, with a voice that tried its best to be steady. "But I'm fine as I am." Elias didn't press, didn't frown, didn't argue. He simply dipped his head in understanding, as though respecting her refusal was a natural extension of respecting her existence. As she walked away, tall shadow stretching over the dusty road, Elias stood still a long time. He noticed every tear in the fabric, every frayed edge, every place where hardship had worn through cloth the same way the world had worn through her spirit. When she was gone, and Clay Laramie's laughter had faded into the clatter of saloon doors, Elias returned to his shop, eyes carrying a new intention. Inside, he gathered pieces of white fabric. Soft ones, strong ones, the kind reserved for weddings and new beginnings. He laid them across his work table, hand trembling not with fear, but with something far gentler. He threaded a needle, pulled it through the first strip, and began to sew, not for charity, not for the town's approval, not even for gratitude he might never receive. He sewed for the quiet figure who walked alone across the plains, wearing a dress that had given up long before she had. He sewed for the strength in her spine, for the ache in her silence, for the heart she kept hidden beneath layers of hurt. He sewed because something in her deserved to feel honored, even if she never wore the dress, even if she never returned, even if she never knew he made it. The needle moved like a whisper, up and down, through and back, stitch by stitch, hope by hope. Outside, the sun climbed higher, and the wind carried the faintest breath of change across the lone territories, as if the world itself knew a story had begun. One quiet stitch at a time, the wind carried her footsteps across the prairie, scattering them like forgotten prayers. She always moved alone, tracing the quiet paths that others had abandoned long ago. The world thought solitude was her choice, but the truth lay deeper, buried under years of swallowed hurt and careful distance. When she walked, people imagined her as a creature of myth, something the earth had carved from stone and sorrow. But she was not born a legend, only shaped into one by loneliness. To understand her now, in the softness of dawn, in the ragged dress that trailed at her heels, one had to return to the old days, to the girl she once was, before the lone territories whispered her name in fear. She had been small, fragile, and ordinary, a rancher's daughter with dust on her shins and braids loose from running through tall grass. She grew quickly, too quickly for her mother's comfort. Every month, another inch. Every season, another pair of boots that didn't fit. Her father tried to hide his unease behind tobacco smoke and long rides away from home, but even she sensed the quiet dread behind his silence. Their neighbors started whispering the same way the wind does before a storm. Too tall, too strong, too strange. Children called her the long shadow. Women muttered prayers under their breath when she passed. Men looked at her the way they looked at broken fence posts, annoyed, uncertain, tempted to replace what they didn't understand. By the time she reached her teens, she stood a head above grown men, and her mother's eyes carried a tremble she tried hard to disguise. One night the house felt colder, emptier, the way all things do right before they change. Her father told her to gather her things. Said she'd be safer with distant cousins on the far plains. But she knew that tone, the one that wraps itself around the edge of a lie. When they reached the old boundary fence, he stopped the wagon, unable to look her in the eyes. "This is where you step down," he said, though the words came jagged and frightened. "You're old enough now, strong enough. You'll manage." And he left her, just like that, dust rising behind the wagon wheels like a curtain closing on childhood. She walked for days, weeks, months, learning loneliness by its first name. The land became her companion, the sky her only witness. And her heart grew quiet, too quiet, the way hearts do when they've learned there's no place meant for them. In Willow Bend, whispers of her past flickered but never settled. People liked mysteries better than truths. And Clay Laramie, with his loud voice and self-satisfied smirk, fed on the tales like a crow circling a dying calf. It didn't matter that she had never harmed anyone, never taken what wasn't hers, never raised her voice against another soul. Fear didn't need reason, only a target. But Elias Whitmore, the tailor with soft hands and softer eyes, watched her story unfold from the edges of town. He never pushed, never pried. He simply observed the way she moved through the world, like a creature made of thunder who'd learned to walk as gently as rain. He saw her long before he ever approached her, saw her helping a stray Mustang tangled in wire near the creek, her big hands trembling as she set it free, saw her leaving food outside the widow Harper's door when winter turned the air brittle, never waiting for thanks, just placing the bundle and disappearing into the dawn. Saw her lift a broken wagon wheel for a traveling family, as if kindness weighed nothing in her arms. Most people saw her size. Elias saw her gentleness. So each night, he returned to the white dress, taking shape beneath his lantern's glow. Not rushed, not perfect, but crafted with a devotion he never shared aloud. A garment fit for someone who had carried too much harshness, for too many miles, with too little praise. One afternoon, the sky felt heavy, as though it had swallowed more sun than it needed. Clay Laramie stood in front of the saloon with a swagger that made even the dust reluctant to settle around him. He was surrounded by men who admired the wrong things. Guns, speed, fear they could stir in others. And in his small, brittle pride, he found joy only in stepping on things gentler than himself. When she passed through town on her way to the trading post, Clay's voice rose, sharp enough to cut. "There she goes," he said, "the walking mountain, trying to pretend she's a woman like the rest. Give it up, girl. Ain't no man alive gonna stand beside a creature built for lifting boulders." His words struck like stones thrown by careless boys. Not fatal, but cruel enough to bruise the spirit. She didn't stop, didn't look back, just kept walking, even as her chest tightened with an old familiar ache. The ache of never being enough, or always being too much, for the people who decided what was normal. But she wasn't alone in hearing Clay's cruelty. Elias stood by a shop door, hands still dusted with chalk. He heard every word, felt each insult land like a blow against something he'd come to protect. Yet he didn't storm across the street, didn't raise his voice, didn't fight fire with fire. Instead, he stored the moment deep inside, the way quiet men do, until the right time to speak arrives. For now, he saw her step aside, shoulders tightened, eyes lowered. And it pained him, how someone so large could still try to make herself small. Later that evening, as the sun sank behind the ridges and painted the sky in aching colors, colors that looked like bruises healing, Elias found her by the river. She sat on a fallen log, massive frame curled inward like a wounded animal trying not to bleed where others might see. The torn edges of her dress hung like wilted petals. She dipped her fingers into the water, watching the ripples distort her reflection into something gentler, something she wished she could be. He approached quietly, his steps careful, his presence soft as twilight. When he reached her, he didn't speak at first, just let the stillness settle between them, like a blanket laid over an old wound. Then, from behind his back, he brought out the bundle, the one wrapped in cloth, the one he had labored over for weeks, the one meant for her. whether she accepted it or not. He sat beside her, leaving enough space that she could walk away if she wished. "I brought you something," his voice murmured, almost swallowed by the sound of the river. "Not because you need it, or because I think you lack anything, but because the world has taken too much from you, and I wanted to give something back, even if it's only thread and fabric." She stared at the bundle, hands unmoving, breath held. When she finally loosened the cloth, a whisper of white spilled into her lap. Soft, clean, sturdy, glimmering faintly in the fading light like moonlit snow. Her breath caught, not because it was beautiful, but because no one had ever given her something made with reverence, made with care, made with belief. Elias lowered his gaze, as though the honesty of the moment was almost too bright to look at directly. "This is not a gift of pity," he said quietly. "This is a dress for someone who's carried battles no one else could bear. Someone who walks like the land itself shaped her. Someone who deserves to feel honored. At least once." She touched the fabric, and her fingers trembled. It was the first trembling he had ever seen in her, and it steadied something inside him, the way truth steadies flame. A part of her wanted to push it away, to reject the kindness, to stay safe inside the world she'd built where hope was a dangerous thing. But she didn't. For once, she didn't. She lifted the dress, held it against her chest, and closed her eyes. Not a word passed her lips, but Elias felt the yes in the way her shoulders dropped, in the way her breath softened, in the way the river's reflection trembled with her heartbeat. That night, in the small shack she called home, she laid the dress beside her, not hanging it, not folding it, just placing it on the bed as though it were something living, something fragile, something she needed. She fell asleep with one hand resting on the fabric, a hand that had never known softness meant for her, only rough roads and harder goodbyes. For the first time in many years, she slept without feeling utterly alone. And somewhere across the quiet town, Elias worked late into the night, fixing small threads, adjusting stitches, mending the hope he'd just placed in her hands. He knew the world might mock, Clay might sneer, and the town might whisper, but he also knew something else, something steady, something true. He had seen her, not the size, not the shadows, not the rumors. He had seen her, and once a man sees clearly, the world can no longer tell him who to fear or who to cherish. Morning drifted over Willowbend like a shy guest, slipping between rooftops and resting on the edges of windowsills. It moved gently, as though afraid to disturb whatever fragile thing had begun to grow in the night. And in a small shack on the outskirts of town, the giant girl woke with her hand still resting on white fabric, fingers curled around the promise stitched into it. The dress lay beside her like a quiet miracle, soft against the old wood, glowing faintly in the first light. For a long time, she simply looked at it, as though it might vanish if she breathed too deeply. Kindness was a rare visitor in her life, and she had learned not to trust rare things. But this dress felt different, as if it had a heart, and that heart whispered, "You deserve gentleness too." She rose slowly, folded the dress with reverence, and held it against her chest as she stepped into the day. The tailor shop woke early with Elias. The lanterns still glowed from his late hours, casting golden shapes across the work table. Threads rested like fallen constellations. Needles gleamed like tiny slivers of hope. Elias had not slept long, but his tiredness felt soft, not heavy, the kind that follows meaningful labor. He moved through the shop with quiet purpose, straightening spools, dusting off the counter, brushing chalk from his sleeves. Yet his hands lingered over the empty spot where the dress had been, feeling the absence of it the way a man feels the absence of a dream he finally dared to follow. When the door creaked open, he looked up, and there she stood, the girl whose shadow touched the top of his doorway, whose heart was far too gentle for the burden she carried. She held the dress carefully, as though returning a borrowed star. She didn't speak, didn't have to. Her eyes, dark and unsteady, carried a question, a quiet tremor of uncertainty. Elias stepped forward, not too close, not too sudden, and took the dress from her arms. If you'd like, he murmured. I can adjust the fit, just a few seams, maybe a gentler shape of the shoulders. Her breath caught, and she nodded, the movement small, almost shy, as though choosing to trust someone felt like stepping barefoot into unknown water. So she sat in the corner of his shop, folding herself as small as she could, while Elias circled her with careful eyes. Taylor's tape resting around his neck, hands hovering respectfully. When he measured the length, he stood back several paces, not because of fear, but because he understood the sacredness of her space. The silence between them was not empty. It was full, brimming, with something warm, something new. It was the kind of silence where two souls begin to recognize each other. Day by day, her steps led her to the tailor's shop, though she never said she was coming, and he never asked her to. At first, she helped him lift crates too heavy for his frame, mending torn curtains, sorting fabrics too large for his small hands. But soon the task softened, shifted, grew into something more delicate. Elias taught her how to hold a needle, how to guide thread without forcing it, how to let stitches bloom one after the other, like wildflowers stubborn enough to root in dry soil. And she taught him things too, how to lift without fear, how to tighten bolts on his shop door, how to balance lumber on her shoulder as though it weighed nothing. They moved around each other with the quiet familiarity of people who had finally found someone who paused long enough to see them. Some days, they didn't speak at all. Elias would hum softly while stitching. She would sit near the window, mending scraps that no one else would save, hands shaking slightly at first, then steadying, slowly, beautifully. Other days brought conversation as gentle as drifting snow. Her voice low, timid, unused to being heard. His voice warm, steady, never rising above what her heart could carry. Bit by bit, they stitched something between them, something wordless, something fragile, something neither dared name. For love does not shout its arrival. It comes softly, walking barefoot, leaving warmth where loneliness once slept. The festival approached like a distant drumbeat. Willow Bend prepared in its own imperfect way. Lanterns hung crooked, fiddles tuned by impatient hands, banners sewn with uneven seams. People spoke of joy, food, dancing, but gossip flowed beneath it all, the kind that traveled on sharp tongues and mean spirits. Clay Laramie sat at the saloon each evening, boots propped, hat tipped, pouring bitter stories into eager ears. Somewhere in that tall girl's head, he said one night, she thinks that Taylor's making a wedding dress for her. Look at her coming by his shop each day, pretending she belongs among decent folk. Poor fool probably thinks someone could care for her. Laughter erupted, ugly, hollow, frigid. Word spread quickly, like fire catching dry brush. By morning, people watched the giant girl with new eyes, not fearful ones, but mocking, as though she had stepped out of her place. And in her heart, the old ache returned, the ache of knowing the world enjoyed punishing anything that dared feel hope. She stopped going to the tailor, stopped walking through town, stopped letting herself imagine she deserved anything more than solitude. She folded the white dress carefully, placed on the highest shelf in her home, and stepped away from it, as though stepping away from a dream that had grown too dangerous to hold. Elias noticed her absence on the first day, felt worry on the second, and something deeper, something sharp, something close to anger. On the third, he had seen the glances, heard whispers, but he did not expect cowardice to win. So on the fourth day, he closed his shop early, wiped his hands on his apron, and walked straight into the saloon. Clay and his men went silent when they saw him, as though a small man entering a room of wolves was entertainment they didn't want to miss. Elias stood before Clay, not tall, not strong, not loud, but steady, so steady the dust itself seemed to pause. You speak of things you do not understand, Elias said, voice quiet but carrying weight. You look at her size and see something strange. I look at her heart and see someone braver than any man in this room. Clay leaned back, smirking, but the confidence in his grin faltered. Elias continued, each word controlled, measured, like a stitch placed exactly where it belonged. She has lifted things you couldn't budge, he said softly. But she has endured things that would break you. She moves through this world without hurting anyone, even those who throw stones at her shadow. And if that makes her different, then it is a difference this West desperately needs. A few men shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eyes lowered, shame trickling in slow, reluctant drops. Clay laughed, but even his laughter trembled. You defending her honor? He sneered. She ain't your problem. Elias stepped forward. Just one step. Small, but enough to draw a line Clay wasn't expecting. She isn't a problem, Elias said. She's a person. One this town does not deserve, but one I will defend. Every single time your cruelty tries to crush her. Silence tightened around them, thick as unspoken truths. Elias turned, walked out, leaving Clay's pride dented, and the saloon hovering in the echo of words no one could unhear. That evening, the wind shifted across Willowbend, carrying something that wasn't quite hope, but wasn't despair either. Something in between, like dawn caught between night and morning. And in her small shack, the giant girl sensed it, like a tremor in the air. She didn't know what had changed, or why, but something inside her, something long silent, stirred. The world had cruelly reminded her she didn't belong. But one man, one gentle soul, had stood in a storm she'd been weathering for years, and declared she was worth protecting, worth seeing, worth honoring, worth something, the kind of worth she had never allowed herself to claim. She looked toward the shelf, toward the folded white dress, toward the hope she had tried to bury. Her fingers ached, not from labor, but from wanting to reach toward something new, something terrifying, something fragile, something beautiful. The dress waited, stitch by patient stitch, like a promise not yet spoken. And outside, the festival drums began to echo, calling the town to celebration, calling her life toward a turning point, calling her heart toward a destiny she had never imagined. The morning of the wedding rose like a held breath over the plains. Soft, pale, almost shy, the kind of dawn that slips in gently so it doesn't wake the mountains too fast. Snow still rested on their peaks, but the valley below glowed gold with the first touches of light, as if the sun itself wished to bless the day before it even began. And in the quiet of that hour, before even the coyotes stopped singing and the first birds dared to stir, Elias stood outside the tailor's cabin, hands trembling just slightly, watching the steam from his coffee rise like a prayer he didn't know he was making. Inside, Lyria was being helped by half the women of the settlement, their hands quick and warm as they circled her, laughing, fixing her hair, adjusting ribbons. For the first time in her life, she did not feel like a giant trying to fit in a world too small. She felt like a woman being seen for who she was, brave, tender, soft in ways the world had tried so hard to harden. The dress hung from her shoulders like a slow promise, white as winter, flowing like the river she used to hide beside when the cruel men threw their stones and their words. Elias had sewn it himself, thread by thread, night after night, carefully, like someone trying to repair a wound they didn't cause, but wished with all their heart they could heal. He had told himself it was simply duty, a tailor's craft, a kindness owed, but the truth lived deeper, quiet, steady, like the root of an old cottonwood tree. He loved her, and it had grown in him slowly, almost without permission, like warmth creeping back into fingertips after a long freeze. He loved her the way dawn loves the mountains, soft, patient, willing to wait for years if that's what light required. And now, in the hush of the morning, he wondered if she could ever love him back, or if he was simply a man who stitched a dress for a future he could never enter. The settlement gathered before noon, all dusted off in their Sunday best, their boots newly polished, their faces glowing with that special kind of joy that comes from witnessing something pure happen in a world that had too much suffering. Even the warriors, those towering nomads with their ragged furs and broad shoulders, arrived early, their numbers stretching into the horizon like a living wall. Every one of them walked with reverence, heads bowed, hands empty of weapons, for today was not a day for battle. but for blessing. They had traveled leagues to keep a promise. For when the first man had cast Lyria aside, crushing her spirit with his shallow heart, it had been these warriors who found her wandering the plains. Bleeding from the inside, they had lifted her up, not as a burden, but as a sister, and sworn that no day of joy in her life would ever feel lonely again. And so they came, ragged, scarred, but noble, to stand behind her like mountains stand behind a valley, quiet, unshakable, ready to roar if she ever needed them to. Elias stood near the small wooden arch he had built himself, hands clasped, heart pacing like a wild horse. The preacher gave him a small nod, the kind that says, "You're ready, even if you do not believe it yet." And then the music began, a slow fiddle, a gentle drum, blended with the deep hum of warrior voices, a sound that felt as old as the earth beneath their boots. All turned, all breathed in, and there she was, Lyria, walking slowly, her steps uneven at first, as if she feared the world might take this moment from her, like so many others before. But when she saw Elias, she steadied, her shoulders softened, her breath deepened. Something in her recognized home, not a place, or a house, or a promise carved in stone, but a person, standing there, hands trembling, eyes shining, heart wide open. The white dress rippled around her like a falling cloud, and with every step she took, Elias felt another thread inside him break open into love. By the time she reached him, his knees nearly gave. The whole settlement faded into the background. Even the warriors, even the mountains. It was just the two of them, in a circle of quiet the world dared not disturb. The preacher began his blessing, his voice low, rich, full of dust and history. But Elias felt the words drifting past him, not ignored, just too distant, because in that moment, he could see only her. Lyria's breath caught, her hands gently lifting the sides of the dress, fingers brushing the seams he had stitched, and she whispered, "I never believed I'd were something made of love." The words slipped into the air like petals, frail, but powerful. Elias felt his throat tighten, and Lyria lifted her gaze, slow, steady, her eyes glistening with something she had never offered any man before. Trust. When the preacher finished, and all that remained was a single question. The air trembled. "Do you take this man?" Lyria closed her eyes, not out of fear, but out of memory. The long road, the bruises, the heartbreak, the nights she thought she'd die alone in the dark, the days she walked the plains like a shadow everyone avoided, everyone but him. And then she spoke, her voice shaking but sure. "I do, because he sees me, and I finally see myself." The warriors stamped their spears into the ground, a thunder-like rhythm, not of war, but of celebration. "Do you take this woman?" Elias could barely breathe, could barely remember how words were made. But he managed. "I do. I always have. Long before I knew what it meant." The kiss, when it came, was not fireworks, not wild passion. It was gentle, warm, like a fire catching at last after a long winter. It was two wounded souls finding the courage to step into the light together. And the settlement erupted. Cheers, tears, whistles, laughter, as if they had all been holding their breath for years. The warriors lifted their voices, deep chants rolling across the valley, a sound that made even the horses bow their heads. Someone began throwing petals made of thin cloth scraps. Someone else beat a drum, and soon, music filled the air like summer rain. As the sun dipped low, the sky bruised purple around the edges. Elias and Lyria stood at the edge of the valley, hand in hand, watching the warriors dance around the fires, their shadows tall, their joy wild and uncontained. Lyria leaned her head on his shoulder, and for the first time in her life, she felt small in the sweetest way, held, cherished, safe. Elias kissed the top of her hair, a soft kiss, barely there, and whispered into the gathering dusk, "You're not a giant. You're just the right size for my heart." Lyria breathed out, a trembling exhale that sounded like a soul finally coming home. The wind curled around them, a quiet blessing, and the night settled, soft, warm, full of firelight and hope. And now, dear listener, dear wanderer of this quiet western tale, as the embers fade and the valley rests, I'll leave you with this. Sometimes, the world will call you too big, too strange, too much, but somewhere, someone is sewing a white dress for your sorrow, turning your hurt into a home, your scars into a map, your story into a song worth singing. Be patient. Your sunrise is on its way. If this tale warmed your heart even a little, light up that like button. Leave your thoughts in the comments. And subscribe for more fireside stories from this old wandering soul. And tell me, from where in this wide, beautiful world are you listening tonight?